Holmes stacked her board of directors with establishment heavyweights such as George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, and General James Mattis, and she cozied up to Bill and Hillary Clinton. Holmes went on the offensive, depicting herself as a Silicon Valley disruptor who had become the target of a smear campaign orchestrated by established interests.
What do you think's going on here?
This is what happens when you work to change things, and first they think you're crazy, then they fight you, and then all of a sudden you change the world. I feel devastated that we did not catch and fix these issues faster.
And will soon be made into a movie starring Jennifer Lawrence as Elizabeth Holmes. Bad Blood raises tough questions about the failure of regulators to stop Theranos, the infatuation of the public and the press with the mystique of Silicon Valley.
And her role model was Steve Jobs, and she took to wearing, turtlenecks like Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was famous for, what became known as the reality distortion field. That, like, people in the room with him, had to bow down to his magnetism and his charisma. A lot of people talked about Elizabeth Holmes in a similar way. What is the essential difference between Steve Jobs' ability to distort reality and Elizabeth Holmes?
Right. So Elizabeth did idolize Jobs. It was to the point that she started, as you mentioned, wearing black turtlenecks, and she wanted Theranos to fly an Apple flag, at half-mast the day that Steve Jobs died. She referred to him as Steve, as if she had been best friends with him. She hired the same ad agency that Apple had used for some of its legendary ad campaigns. When she found out that that ad agency had met with Steve Jobs on Wednesdays, she decreed that she would have her meetings with the agency Chiat Day on Wednesdays. And as you say, she did share this trait, which is like Jobs, she had this ability to sort of put a spell on people with her big blue eyes that blinked rarely, and this deep voice of hers.
Whenever there's a quote-unquote glass ceiling, there's an iron woman right behind it.
And also her intelligence. She's a very intelligent woman. I would say that the big difference and the reason why it was a fatal mistake for her to model herself after Jobs and Apple is that Apple was a computer company.
The board of directors and kind of high-profile investors in Theranos, also kind of, an all-star cast, including people like George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, General Mattis. What role did that play? I mean, the cultivation of these kind of superstar hangers-on.
This is something that Elizabeth did from the very beginning. She cultivated the backing of someone who was older, more experienced, and had a good reputation. The first person she did that with was Channing Robertson, her engineering professor at Stanford. He was a star of the Stanford School of Engineering, and he joined her board when she founded Theranos and accompanied her to pitch meetings with VCs. Then a year or two later, she met Donald L. Lucas, a well-known venture capitalist in Silicon Valley who groomed Larry Ellison, the Oracle founder, and helped him take Oracle public in the mid-'80s. And then, unfortunately, Don Lucas started developing Alzheimer's disease in the 2010-2011 period. So she pivoted to George Shultz, the famous former Secretary of State who crafted the Reagan administration's foreign policy, is credited by many as having won the Cold War. And
long-standing interest in kind of the pharma industry, drug legalization. I mean, he's a great elder statesman who's widely respected.
Yes, and his house is right off the Stanford campus on Stanford land, and he's also passionate about science. And so when he met Elizabeth in 2011, he was immediately taken in by her, wowed by what she claimed her technology could do, joined her board, and then proceeded to introduce her to all his buddies at the Hoover Institution, the conservative think tank on the Stanford campus. And that's how she came to meet Henry Kissinger, Bill Perry, who had been Secretary of Defense under Clinton, Bill Frist, Sam Nunn, Admiral Roughhead. And pretty soon all these guys were on the board too. Elizabeth lured them with grants of stock. And before you knew it, she had this board chock full of these amazing, people with amazing resumes.
As I was reading the book and following the account, I mean, the kind of feminist in me cropped up. I mean, because part of this, it just sounds like she is, really working, in a kind of old screwball comedy or something. She's a femme fatale who is like wrapping her, these guys around her finger. I mean, is that at work here? Or?
That was definitely at work. And I know, it's pretty controversial to say this amid the Me Too movement, but, the 15-year history of the company shows that that is what she did over and over again. These older men, she wrapped them around her fingers. She made them support her and believe in her. And I think she did it in part with her intelligence. She's a very smart woman, and she did it with her charm. She has these big blue eyes, and she has this charisma, and they were kind of taken in. It ranges from Channing Robertson and Don Lucas at the beginning to Kissinger, and then David Boies and Rupert Murdoch at the end of the story.
This is a good time to bring up the press, because you have companies like Walgreens buying in without doing due diligence. You have investors buying in without really understanding what's going on. You talk about how the first chief financial officer was like, I don't really understand this, and it doesn't seem to be working, but I guess it does. I mean, like, there's that. The press was generally uncritical of her, and in many cases, they're the ones who kind of made her into an investment or a Silicon Valley superstar. Why did the press buy in? The press is supposed to be the bulldog and the watchdog of democracy and of the market.
Well, she worked the press expertly. I mean, one thing that should be noted is the first mainstream publication that put her on the map was my newspaper, the Wall Street Journal. The editorial page of the Journal did a friendly interview with her in its Saturday edition in a column called The Weekend Interview, and this was back in September of 2013, and it coincided with the launch of Theranos fingerstick tests in Walgreens stores. And then the story, I would say, that really rocketed her to fame about 6 or 8 months later was the cover story in Fortune magazine that was published in June 2014, and she's shown, with a black turtleneck and bright red lipstick. The headline, I think, is "This CEO is out for blood," and that was a really arresting photo, and it really made her a celebrity in Silicon Valley and beyond. That said, I don't blame the press too much, because people like Roger Parloff, who wrote that cover story, and then Ken Auletta, who wrote a long profile of Elizabeth Holmes 6 months later in The New Yorker, were outright lied to by her. I mean, they were deceived.
Oh, but no, you're a reporter. When your mother tells you she loves you, you check it out. I mean, Ken Auletta fits into this, old man kind of getting
And Roger Parloff was a legal correspondent for Fortune, and Ken Auletta writes mostly about media and technology, not healthcare.
Right.
Neither of them had any expertise in medicine, and certainly not laboratory science. Roger went and talked to all these larger-than-life board members and kind of used them to get corroboration from them that she was the real thing. And all he heard from them was, gushing words of praise. Yeah, I mean, I guess that they were really deceived, and they didn't necessarily go into those interviews and into those stories thinking that they should be on their guards about, someone who was a pathological liar, which she was.
What about governance? You put together this incredible board of directors that included George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, Sam Nunn, Admiral Roughhead, very distinguished individuals, none of whom have ever run a company, and none of whom knew anything about the science of what you were doing.
There's no reason why these can't be distributed in very, very decentralized locations.
Your home?
Yeah.
You think people's homes should have these, essentially a clinical laboratory in their own house?
I think that's a very interesting space.
Of course, in the middle of all this are patients whose health depended on Theranos for accurate results.
There's this man who goes by the initials RC right now in Arizona, who is suggesting that the lab results that he got from Theranos were not accurate, and it led to him having a heart attack. Based on what you know, is it possible that what he's saying is true? Could he have gotten a lab result that was so askew that he didn't act on it, and then a month later he ended up having a heart attack?
I'm not the lab director, and so...
I know, but you're the CEO and founder of the company. I mean, this is as serious as it gets.
What I know is that I've put the best people in place to be able to investigate every aspect of this and ensure that we meet the quality standards that we hold ourselves to, and I know they're doing that.
It's probably the most important question I think anybody who's watching has about this. Does it work?
Yes.
You're confident in that?
I am confident in that.
Well, there's another element through the book that I love, this insular nature of what basically is a Stanford contingent. And you've got some, I regard, genuine villains, including people I revered. George Shultz is a villain in this story. David Boies, the attorney, is a villain in this story. I have to tell you, General Mattis is a villain in this story.
Well, these are people, I mean, two of them, Mattis and Schultz, were on the board of Theranos, and I agree with you, they don't come off looking good. Oof. In the story. I don't think they realized that Theranos was doing most of the blood tests on these hacked commercial machines. In fact, I've seen documentation recently from the SEC inquiry that pretty much shows they had no idea. And so she was lying to her board as well.
Okay.
I believe that even David Boies, whose associates certainly don't come off looking good in the book, after what they did with Tyler Schultz, George Schultz's grandson, whom they ambushed at one point in his own grandfather's house. Even David Boies, I don't think, knew that out of 250 blood tests on the menu, you had more than 240 that were being done on hacked commercial analyzers.
Okay, now there is an element of Jonestown here. When I was a reporter, I covered Jonestown and what happened. And for the most part, the people who drank the Kool-Aid were not that educated and not that worldly. How could this con artist convince so many brilliant people? So many brilliant. Is it the blacks? Is it the black shirt? Is it the deep voice? Is it the Steve Jobs? I mean, these are brilliant thinkers, and they were all conned.
Right, and I think the answer to that is she's a very smart woman, very charismatic. One aspect of her is that she really did believe in her vision. She really did believe that creating this machine that would be able to run every test known to man off just a pinprick of blood, that would really be good for society, and that it would do good. And so I think she has this condition called noble cause corruption, which is that she ultimately believed that what she was going to achieve when she got there was going to be a good thing for humanity, and therefore every lie and every corner she cut along the way was justified.
And almost every media outlet, including us here at CBS, bought into the Theranos myth.
Well, she not only disappointed millions of ordinary people who believed her promises of an affordable and easy blood test, but she also duped her investors. And that's an interesting aspect of this story. How did a young woman with no track record convince rich and experienced people like Rupert Murdoch to part with millions?
Her first big backer was former neighbour and venture capitalist Tim Draper, who invested $1 million. A friend of her dad's introduced her to another venture capitalist, Don Lucas, who hooked her up with Oracle founder Larry Ellison. Big break there, he put in $100 million, and with his seal of approval, all the doors were open. Holmes was granted a meeting with former Secretary of State George Shultz, who joined her board, and he opened the door to other conservative elder statesmen, including another former Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. Momentum built, and at the height of the Theranos hype, General James Mattis and former Navy Admiral Gary Roughead climbed on board. So too did successful businessmen, including the former CEO of Wells Fargo.
We've got rich, successful people, accomplished people, going in after Ellison. In fact, you could put Ellison in that group, putting money into something they didn't really understand.
Right. This goes on more often than we would like to think. But in this particular case, what makes it so interesting is that you had a very attractive person with a very attractive story. A story that we would want to believe, a story that involved social good, a story that involved the potential for great wealth increase, and it was quite seducing. Generating positive emotion is really important, and Elizabeth Holmes knew how to do that. One of the biggest weaknesses in the Theranos board was that it included no scientists, and I think that was by design. My guess would be it would be by design on Elizabeth Holmes's part, in order that there would be no questioning.
Mr. Sunny Balwani is an older gentleman, at least 20 years older, and he loaned her money. So when she's talking about an attractive person, an attractive woman who was there and it was a great story, he clearly bought into that. He gave her $20 million, ended up sleeping with her, He had a license plate that said Vini Vidi Vici. You know, I came, I saw, I conquered.